Hello, this is a follow-up tutorial to where we integrated our Metahuman with the ALS system. In this tutorial we're going to take it and fix some issues that we had with holding objects so that it actually holds the objects correctly. At the end of the tutorial this is what you can expect to have. So let's get started. Alright, welcome back guys. So this is a follow-up tutorial as I previously said. We should have a Metahuman that's fully integrated with ALS. We can do the montages for mantling. The feet IK should be working, and it should all be looking pretty good. We can roll. The only issue now that you may have saw is when we try to hold items, like this box or this barrel or this torch. It's all on the ground, right? So in this tutorial, this is what we're going to actually be working towards. We're going to be working on the torch. I'm only going to show you how to do the torch in this tutorial because doing the rest of them is pretty much the same process. You just have to do all the tweaking for the animation and for the skeleton and the sockets and stuff. So let's get started. So the first thing I want to go a little into detail as to what is happening and why our Metahuman is not holding the object correctly is because if we actually look at the ALS mannequin, we can look at the hands, right? The hands, there's this hand root for IK that's on the mannequin. And if you look, our mannequin or our skeleton for the Metahuman, it doesn't come provided with hand IK. And so when we try to attach things to these parts on our Metahuman, like the barrel, the gun, or the box, or the torch, it has nothing to attach to. So it just goes to the bottom. So a nifty way to, or a good way to work around this is to use sockets. So that's what we're going to start with. So since we're doing the torch, if we actually look here, the torch is held in the left hand if I'm not mistaken. So he brings up his left hand. I'm actually going to close that out. So we want to put a socket on his left hand. So let's start there. So we're in a Metahuman base skeleton. We're going to search for hand, come down to hand L, right click it. We're going to add a socket. So when we add the socket, you can see it's added and parent to hand L. I actually want to rename this, so I'm going to hit F2, and I'm going to do hand underscore L torch. And then the next thing we want to do is actually have a preview animation of a pose so that we can be pretty similar to what we're working with. This will come in handy in the future, and I'll show you why. So let's come up to preview animation. Let's actually look for, I'm not sure, torch. Yeah, torch. So meta props torch poses. If you actually look for things like barrel or box, they all have these poses to them. So when you're doing the future ones, it's important to have a preview animation because it's a lot easier to position and make tweaks to where the item is going to be attached to. So let's do the props torch. Let's add that on. You see how our skeleton changes his animation pose. If you're not getting these skeleton bones, all you have to do is come up to character, come under bones, and click on all hierarchy, and it'll pop up all these bones so that you're not just looking at hands and ankles. So let's save that. Let's actually do one more thing. Let's click on this torch, right click it, and we want to add a preview asset so we can see what he's holding. So let's type in torch again, and we can click on the static mesh. As you see, the torch comes in upside down, and this is where we need to start doing some tweaks, right? So the first thing we can do, we can start fixing this. Make sure that you have the socket clicked, and we're going to start tweaking this a little bit. So I want to rotate it. Actually, so let's rotate this up. I want my snapping on. That's why. There we go. So I'm going to rotate it probably 160 degrees. I want to move it a little bit more, move it like up right there. Let's turn down the camera speed, zooming way too fast. Let's move this a little bit more into there, and that's a good starting point, I think. So now we can save that. And the next thing we have to do now is open up our character blueprint. So we have the socket rotated and positioned in the left hand. Now we want to get that socket so we can attach a torch to it. So we're in a blueprint for our character, right? And if you haven't dived too deep into it, it's made up of it has a lot of stuff going on, but everything is commented. You can search for basically anything that you need to find, and what we want is actually under these functions. It's called held object. It's the category. In this category, it's a bunch of different functions, 4 to be exact, that deal with holding objects. So if we actually look at one of these, it's called attached to hand. I'm not going to go too deep into everything that's going on, but do know that it's all pretty much straightforward and really easy to do. We start here with a function. This function gets called, comes to a sequence, and then it's a sequence is just basically do this first, then do that second, then do that third, and then do that fourth. So super helpful. So the first thing it does is it clears any held object. So if you're holding a box, for instance, then it would clear the box from the held object and then put the torch on. Second, it then gets the new static mesh, which is this up here, which is which is part of the function input. It gets that. You'll see how we get that in a second. And then we set the static mesh for our static mesh. We're actually going to rename these because the naming scheme can get really confusing, as you just saw. And then it does the same. It gets the skeletal mesh. So if it's a skeletal mesh, then it will attach the skeletal mesh to the held object root. And then it attaches the component to the component. And this is where you can see right here, if we were using the ALS skeleton, these are the virtual bones for the hand IK that it's attaching to. So with that said, we can actually copy most of this. So I'm going to just select all this, Control C. So what we're going to do, actually I got ahead of myself. We're not going to do that yet. So if we come over here and we look at update held object. Now this is where, with all the overlay states, is attaching the items. So for instance, if you had a rifle, it would attach it here. So the rifle is a skeletal mesh. This is what I was talking about, the input. So the inputs is where you would select the static mesh or the skeleton. And for instance, we're selecting a skeletal mesh for the M9, and then that's going to be passed in to attach hand, and that's where this comes from. And that's how it gets set. So if we go back to held object, you see that all these functions are using attach hand. Now you could use attach hand for the torch, but then you're going to run into problems because when you try to attach a barrel or you try to attach a box, it's going to put the same socket. So we actually want our own function for the torch so that we can use different sockets for different items that we want to hold, for instance. So let's get started with that. Let's come over here to our functions and let's create a new function. Let's call attach torch to hand. And I want to click and drag that into the category held object. As you see, it pulls open and it's completely empty. First thing we're going to want to do is click on this function node, and we can add some inputs. So if you remember from our attached to hand, if we click on this node, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different inputs. We don't need the left hand, we don't care about that boolean, we just care about the other 4. So we have a static mesh, we have a skeletal mesh, and we have a vector for offset if you ever wanted to offset it by any values. So let's add those. Oops. So I'm going to add in 4 parameters. 3, 4. So remember the first one was a new static mesh. And that was of type static mesh. So we type in static mesh. We select the object reference for static mesh right here. The next one was a skeletal, so new skeletal mesh. And that's of type skeletal mesh. Oops. Skeletal mesh, we want object reference. The next one was a new anim class. In case you ever had a different set of animations that you wanted to play for some object for any reason, then you could also set that. That's going to be of type object. So we come down to object, class reference. I just want to double check, make sure that, yep, so it is of type object, okay. And then the next one is offset. So offset, and that is a type vector, so right down here. Okay, great. And now before we go forward, I actually want to rename these held object roots, because the naming can get confusing with our new static mesh inputs. So I want to take this, and you can either click it or hit F2. And I want to say our static mesh, or held static mesh, held static mesh, and then same for here. F2, held skeletal mesh. Okay, compile, save that. So now we already know we're going to need a sequence node. We could either do that, or we can do take the hard work out for us, and we can get the layout. Basically everything's going on, so we can just select everything and then copy it, and then Control V. So it's just a lazy man's way to do it, instead of making this video longer than it needs to be. Plus you'll get a lot of practice if you decide to implement the rest of the objects. It's going to be all the same thing, you're just going to make different functions for each one. And then you can practice and set this up so you can have a better understanding. For this, we're going to just delete this because we're going to want to name our own socket. So let's start at the first one. We have then 0. So first we clear the held object. It's going to set the held static mesh, which remember is right here, and then it's going to set it to empty. It's going to do the same for the skeletal mesh, and the same for the anim class. After that, we're going to then take our new static mesh, if there's anything to set for new static mesh, and we're going to set that for our held static mesh. As you can see, this is a grayed out node, so we need to actually delete this. And then I'm just going to pull this up a little bit, organize this a little bit more. And so we have to get the new static mesh. So what you can do is you can drag off, you can type in new static mesh. Don't freak out if you don't see anything, just because the context sensitive is turned on. So we can uncheck that, and you see we have our get new static mesh. And now we need to right click this, and we need to convert this to a validated get. Once you do that, we can put an execution pin into it. And so if it's valid, then we want to set our new static mesh. If it's not valid, we don't want to do anything. So we need to set this new static mesh into new mesh. We're going to do the same exact thing for our skeletal mesh. So just organize a little bit more. So we're going to pull off the execution pin. We're going to say new skeletal mesh. Remember, if it doesn't show up and this is ticked for any reason, just untick it, and then you can get it. Right click it, convert to validated get. Let's add that. It is valid, and we want to set the new mesh, or new skeleton mesh, into there. And now we have to do the same for the anim class. So click, delete it, pull off the execution pin, new anim class, should pull up because we still have that unticked, and select that. Same thing, right click, convert to validated get. Then let's connect these. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is we get to number 3, where it actually attaches the component to the socket. So the way we do that is, if you remember what you named your socket, we have an error real quick. Property offset. Okay, so let's just delete that. Right click, off, get offset, and that should be it. You're probably not going to be using this offset, to be honest. You might, but I don't see why you would. Okay. So the way we attach this node, attach component to component, the way it works is it gets a socket name. Takes that socket name and attaches, takes the target and then also the parent. So the target is our held object root, which is right here, which has both of our static and skeletal mesh. And our parent is our character, which is the mesh. And so we want the socket name. And if you remember, we made the socket name right here. It's called hand-L torch. If you click on details, we can just double click this, because we want to make sure that the name is precise. We don't want to make any mistakes, because we could be chasing our own tail. We're like, it's not working. Why is it not working? And then you find out you forgot underscore or something. So let's just make sure that we copy that, Control C. We come back, and in socket name, we're going to put that in there. Hand-L torch. With that said, we should be good to go now. So we can compile that. We can come back to update held object. If you don't have it up here, you can find it under held object, update held object. If we follow our torch for our overlay state, follow the torch, and it's right here. We can actually delete this. I'm not going to be using it. Attach torch to hand, bring it up, connect the execution pin to torch, come back down, and now this is important because we've got to make sure that we're given the correct input for our function in order to set the torch. So, new static mesh. The torch is a static mesh, so we want to type in torch and select it, and then compile and save. So now if we run the game and we check, it should be working. And look at that. Now we have our torch. So another thing I'm going to show you before we sign off for today is you're going to come and run into some issues with the box and barrel where you need to actually make some changes to it, like your hand placement or the box placement or something. And we can actually do something that's pretty cool. If we open up our skeleton, drag it off so that we can have it in a separate window, bring it up, enlarge it a little bit more, to get a better look. Try it right here. Actually, this is good right here. Hit Shift F1 to get your mouse back from the window. So now let's take a look at this. We can actually look, and during runtime, we can take this on the socket, and we can make adjustments to it actually. So for instance, if I wanted to rotate it, I can rotate it. If I needed to move it, I could move it, all during runtime. So this makes making tweaks a lot easier, instead of having to exit out, restart, and hoping it was good. Another thing I want to show you before we go is, if I can find it, preview. Let me open up this. This is our animation for the torch pose. So if we actually search for that using the magnifying glass, double click it to open it. I'm going to pause that because he's going crazy. Bring this back up for my skeleton. I actually want to drag that in the same spot. Let's go back to frame 1. Now if we look for hand, actually you'll notice this with the box, and this is why I'm showing you, so you can make adjustments accordingly. So for instance, your hand, right now for the torch it's pretty well set, but if we wanted to take the hand and make like adjustments to it or something, let's say do something crazy so I can show you. We do that, we're on frame 0, the first frame. We make that change. What we need to do then is up here, let me actually enlarge this. You have this key button. After you make the change, you're going to hit key. It's going to key the change. It's not going to work, so you need to hit apply. We can save that. You'll actually look in your skeleton mesh, you'll see that the hand placement has changed. Let's minimize that and look in our game now. Look at that. His torch is going through his eyeball. So this is important because you're going to notice with the box, when you're holding the box, it's not going to be perfect placement. Like his hands, you're gonna have to change his left hand. For the barrel, you're gonna have to change the placement a little bit of his hand. And for the barrel, you can actually, when you do it, you can actually change the scale of the socket. So if we come back to our skeleton, I want to minimize this a little bit. You can actually change, if I can get it. Doesn't want to change with my hotkey, so let's see. Scale mode. You can actually change. Let's make it really big. Let's come back here. You can actually you can change the scale of the torch, so now it looks like a big matchstick or something. So that's pretty much it, guys. Let's do a quick rundown of everything that we learned, just so that there's no misunderstandings or anything. So what we did is we came here, we made changes to, we added a socket to our left hand so that we could use that socket to then, we could use that socket to attach a static mesh to. We created our own function for attach torch to hand. We went to update held object. We added our new function attached to hand instead of the regular attached to hand object or function. We chose the static mesh for the torch. We then came in and we made changes to the socket, like rotation, location, or scale. And then I also showed you how to make changes for your actual bone structure by coming and opening up the pose animation for the torch. Hope you guys found that useful. If you have any questions, just let me know and I'll try to respond accordingly. Thank you.